Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we step quietly into the shadows of the past, a world where justice was not always fair, and punishment was unforgettable. This is not a tale of glory, but of survival, of pain, of the grim creativity of the medieval mind. If you enjoy these gentle journeys through hidden history, do consider subscribing, liking the video, and leaving a comment. Your support helps keep these forgotten stories alive. Now, let us begin. Number 1. The Drunkard's Cloak. In the chilly cobbled lanes of 16th century England, not all crimes called for the stocks or the gallows. For the petty crime of drunkenness, local officials often turned to a punishment both absurd and humiliating: the drunkard's cloak. Imagine a man stumbling out of a tavern, ale still warm in his belly, only to be seized by the watchman. By morning, he would find himself placed in the market square wearing a large wooden barrel, with holes cut for his arms and head, trapped like a walking keg. This wasn't just a prank. The weight of the barrel was real, and its burden was meant to remind all passers-by of his shame. Crowds often gathered to jeer, laugh, and point. Children might run circles around the offender, mimicking his unsteady walk. 4 hours, sometimes an entire day, he would carry his guilt openly, until he could no longer lift his arms or hold up the heavy cask. The drunkard's cloak did not break bones, but it crushed the spirit. It was punishment by laughter, and humiliation was the whip. Number 2. The Ducking Stool. For women accused of being quarrelsome, especially if they dared to argue in public or speak harshly to their husbands, there was a device the town square feared and secretly relished: the ducking stool. At first glance, it looked like a large wooden chair fastened to a long plank. It might sit on the edge of a river or hang over a pond. The accused would be strapped in tightly, dress bunched up around her knees, hands bound to the armrests, as villagers gathered around. With a creak and a splash, the stool would be lowered, down into the water. Gasping for breath, soaked to the skin, the woman would be raised only briefly before being dunked again. There was no set number of times. Sometimes it was 3, sometimes 5, sometimes until the onlookers were satisfied. Her crime: being loud, perhaps too opinionated, or perhaps simply disliked. It was called correction, but in truth it was control, forced silence, soaked in cold water and shame. The ducking stool was not only for witches. It was often for wives. Yet even after the ordeal, the dampness lingered, not just in her bones, but in the eyes of those who watched her walk home. Number 3. The scold's bridal. There were places in medieval Europe, especially in England and Scotland, where the greatest sin a woman could commit was speech. If she was known to gossip, to argue, to speak ill of others or complain loudly, she might find herself gifted with one of the cruelest instruments of domestic punishment: the scold's bridle, also called the brank. It looked like a metal cage, crafted with cruel precision to fit over a woman's head like a helmet. But at its core was the real horror: a flat piece of metal, sometimes spiked, designed to press down on the tongue or wedge it in place. The moment she tried to speak, she would injure herself. The woman would be led through town in this contraption, a bell sometimes attached to call attention to her disgrace. She could not cry out. She could not explain. All she could do was walk, the metal scraping her lips, her tongue swelling beneath the bridle's tongue plate. People watched. They always did. Some laughed, some whispered, some turned away. But all remembered the sight. And that was the point. The bridle left no scars on the skin, but inside, a silence often remained forever. Number 4. The iron chair. If you were brought before the authorities in parts of France or Germany during the late Middle Ages, and you were unlucky enough to be accused of theft, betrayal, or heresy, there was a punishment that waited in cold silence: the iron chair. It was not a symbolic name. The chair was real, entirely iron. Its back, its arms, its seat, all covered with sharp spikes. The accused was stripped and bound tightly upon it, their weight pressed down into those metal points. It was not meant to kill. Not immediately. The spikes did not pierce deep, but they covered the skin in tiny punctures. Thousands of them, each one aching, burning, throbbing. The pain was constant and sharp, and often combined with heat. In some regions, coals were placed beneath the chair, slowly warming the metal and the body it held. The longer one sat, the less one could move. The body became frozen in pain, the mind trembling under fear. The chair was used for interrogation, for confession, and often just for terror. Few people who sat in it forgot it. Fewer still spoke of it afterward. The iron chair left the bones whole, but the nerves, the memories, the soul, all frayed and broken. Number 5. The heretic's fork. Sometimes the worst punishment was not death itself, but the weight. In the shadowy chambers of the Inquisition, where whispers of doubt were treated as poison, one might find oneself fitted with a cruel device called the heretic's fork. It was deceptively simple, just a rod of metal with sharp prongs at each end, one side pressed beneath the chin, the other just above the breastbone or beneath the throat. It didn't pierce deep, but it didn't need to. It kept the neck rigid, the mouth closed, the body trembling. For if the person moved, if they nodded off or slumped forward, the prongs would stab deeper, reminding them sharply that pain was just one breath away. A leather strap held the fork in place. Often, the victim was left standing. They could not speak. They could not rest. They could only exist, upright, silent, and still, with sleep forever out of reach. This was not just a punishment of the body. It was a punishment of exhaustion, the kind that breaks a person slowly, by denying them the one thing every living creature needs: rest. Number 6. The breaking wheel. In the open square, before crowds that whispered and children who clutched their mothers' skirts, there stood the breaking wheel, also called the Catherine wheel, though its elegance ended with its name. It was no more than a large wooden wagon wheel, mounted horizontally or vertically, but it was not meant to carry goods. It was meant to carry pain. The condemned was tied to it, limbs splayed across the spokes. Then, one by one, their arms, legs, ribs were shattered with a heavy iron bar. Not just once, but methodically, deliberately, often following a precise sequence so the person would remain alive, but immobile. Sometimes the broken limbs were then threaded between the spokes. Sometimes the wheel was hoisted up for all to see, turning slowly with the breeze as birds circled. And sometimes the end was swift, a mercy blow to the chest or throat. But in many cases it was not. The broken body was left exposed to time, to animals, to the judgment of heaven. The breaking wheel was not just torture. It was spectacle. And in that spectacle, it asked one question again and again: is this what happens to those who disobey? Number 7. The Spanish Tickler. Its name might sound almost foolish to modern ears, but those who saw it used knew better. The Spanish Tickler was not a toy. It was a handheld instrument of pure agony, crafted from iron, shaped like claws, with curved, sharp prongs designed to pierce and shred human flesh. This tool was raked across the victim's skin, often on the limbs, chest, or back. In some cases, it was used on the face. The goal, not to kill, but to maim. With each slow pass, the skin tore open in ragged lines, exposing nerves, blood, and sinew. There was no clean cut, no neat wound, just shredded muscle and the sickening sound of tearing. Sometimes, the victim was restrained against a wall. Other times, tied to a post in the public square. The tickler made no distinction between man or woman, noble or peasant, and perhaps worst of all, it could be wielded again and again. There were no limits, only the strength of the arm and the durability of the body beneath it. Number 8. The Brazen Bull. Few punishments in history have blurred the line between creativity and cruelty so terribly as the Brazen Bull. Said to have originated in ancient Greece but whispered about throughout medieval lore, it was a hollow statue, cast entirely from bronze, in the shape of a powerful bull. Inside was space for a person. The condemned would be locked within, and beneath the bull's belly a fire would be lit. As the flames licked the metal and the metal began to glow, the person inside would roast alive. Their screams, terrible and panicked, would echo through a series of twisted tubes in the bull's head, designed specifically to make it sound like the bellowing of a beast. To the onlookers, it was a show. To the person inside, it was unbearable. Some versions tell of scented herbs added to mask the smell of burning flesh. Others describe the bull being polished to a mirror shine, so its horror gleamed even under the sun. And though it's uncertain how often this punishment was truly used in medieval Europe, the legend of the Brazen Bull endured, because it symbolized what all punishments threaten. That cruelty can wear the face of ceremony. That pain can be made to sing. Number 9. The oubliette. There were no flames here. No blades. Just stone. Damp. Darkness. An oubliette was a type of dungeon, small, narrow, and deliberately cruel. The word comes from the French oublier, meaning to forget, and that's precisely what it was for. A person would be lowered, or sometimes dropped, into a deep cylindrical pit, often carved into the foundations of a castle. There were no stairs, no door, only a small hole at the top, like the mouth of a well. Once inside, there was no room to stand, no place to lie flat. One could crouch, or collapse. The floor was wet, slimy, sometimes layered with bones of the previous occupants. And the darkness was complete. Not a flicker of candlelight, not even a sound, except the scratching of rats or the occasional drip of water from the stones above. People were left there to die slowly, from hunger, thirst, madness. There was no trial after the oubliette, no rescue. It was a sentence of silence, not pain, but disappearance. Sometimes nobles used it to get rid of rivals without scandal. Other times it was punishment for spies, debtors, or prisoners who had angered someone powerful. And the world above, it moved on. The oubliette was, after all, easy to forget. Number 10. The sarcophagus of vermin. This punishment did not strike fast. It was patient. Imagine being stripped of your clothes. Imagine being laid flat on a wooden table, or sometimes locked inside a coffin made of stone or metal, hollowed just enough to fit your body snugly. Now imagine your skin coated in milk and honey. Insects and vermin were drawn to the sweet scent. Flies laid eggs. Ants bit and stung. Beetles burrowed. And sometimes, when the location allowed, rats and mice would be introduced, hungry and frantic, with only one direction to go, inward. The body would be slowly consumed, inch by inch, by things that crawled, chewed, and multiplied. This punishment was a form of living burial. The condemned could not move, could not scream long before exhaustion set in, and all the while they remained conscious. It is said that the Persian Empire used such a method, but echoes of it, crude and whispered, found their way into medieval torture law, passed from dungeon to dungeon, from shadow to shadow. It wasn't just death. It was decay, while alive. The sarcophagus was closed tight, not to contain the body, but to keep the vermin in. Number 11. The burning iron crown. In some corners of medieval Europe, especially where kings and clergy held tight control, the punishment for heresy was not always the pyre. Sometimes it was the crown. Fashioned from iron or bronze, a circlet would be crafted to mimic the look of a royal or holy crown. Crosses, flourishes, or even mock gemstones were carved into its surface. But unlike the crowns of kings, this one was placed into a bed of coals until it glowed red with heat, and then it was pressed onto the head of the accused. The metal seared through flesh almost instantly. The skin of the scalp, thin and sensitive, bubbled and blackened. The heat traveled down through the skull, boiling blood in the veins and igniting a scream that often echoed through monastery walls. But the punishment was not only physical, it was meant to mock, to say, "You thought you were chosen. You thought you knew better than the church. Now wear this crown, forged not of gold, but of flame." Sometimes the person was already dead or unconscious when the crown was applied, executed first, and then crowned in mockery. At other times they were kept alive, long enough to feel every moment. A symbol of divine favor was turned into a tool of wrath. Number 12. The salted tongue. Words have weight. In the medieval world, they could also carry deadly consequences. This punishment was reserved for liars, for slanderers, for those who insulted the wrong noble or questioned the holy texts. A person would be dragged into the square, mouth held open with iron hooks or wooden props. The tongue was the focus. First, it might be pierced, a sharp, hooked blade drawn through its base, fixing it to a wooden table. Then came the salt, coarse salt, crystals thick and jagged. It was packed directly into wounds cut across the surface of the tongue, sometimes with knives, other times with burning pokers. The salt did not kill, not immediately, but it burned. It swelled the tongue to grotesque proportions. It made speech impossible, eating unbearable. 4 days afterward, the person would be unable to swallow without agony. Many choked, others starved, especially if the punishment was combined with temporary imprisonment. It was a lesson taught not with words, but by taking them away. A single sentence could condemn, and with this punishment, the mouth that spoke it became a monument of suffering. Number 13. The iron spider. This punishment was as horrifying as it was rare, whispered about more than widely used, but it did exist, especially in the darker corners of the Holy Roman Empire and some Eastern European courts. The iron spider was a hinged, claw-like device, made of iron prongs shaped like the legs of a great, grasping insect. It was used to punish traitors, arsonists, and sometimes women accused of blasphemy or rebellion. The device would be heated until it glowed. Then it would be placed onto a person's bare breast, stomach, or back, often used against women specifically to maximize shame. The spider's sharp legs would pierce and cling to the flesh, and once it was in place, it would be yanked away, ripping muscle, skin, and sometimes entire chunks of tissue with it. The punishment did not always kill, but it often left the victim horrifically scarred. To make matters worse, this act was frequently done in front of crowds, as theatre, as deterrent, and as a declaration of dominance. The iron spider left no one untouched. Not the punished, not the watchers. Number 14. The drowning stool. While witch trials are often associated with fire, water was just as cruel a weapon. The drowning stool, or cucking stool, was commonly used in England and Scotland from the 13th to 17th centuries. It began as a punishment for scolding wives, gossiping women, or those accused, often baselessly, of witchcraft. The condemned woman would be bound to a wooden chair, her arms tied tight, her ankles fastened to prevent resistance. Then, using a long wooden beam or mechanical lever, the chair was suspended over a river or deep pond. Slowly, deliberately, she would be lowered into the water, held there just long enough to inhale panic, to feel her lungs tighten, to wonder if this would be the moment she drowned. Then raised again, and again, and again. Some women survived this test, only to endure exile or public ridicule. Others died, either by drowning or by shock. In some towns, it wasn't just a punishment, it was a spectacle. Crowds would gather, children would point, vendors would sell roasted nuts and cider, and all the while, a woman gasped and choked at the end of a wooden pole, helpless and shaking. It was not justice. It was humiliation made into public entertainment. Number 15. The Mask of Shame. Long before prisons became common, public humiliation was a favored form of punishment across medieval Europe. One particularly inventive method was the use of iron shame masks, ornately cruel devices made not just to punish, but to mock. These masks were often shaped into exaggerated facial expressions. A long nose for liars, a fat tongue for gossipers, horns for adulterers, a twisted grin for fools or blasphemers. They were made of cold iron, often lined with sharp or jagged metal along the inside. Some included gag-like bars that held the tongue in place, making speech painful or impossible. Others had small bells at the top, so that every step echoed through the streets with the sound of disgrace. A person might be marched through town wearing such a mask, or chained to a post in the market square. Children would throw fruit. Neighbors would jeer. The mask didn't just hide the face, it redefined it, making the condemned a living symbol of their crime. The punishment didn't necessarily harm the body permanently, but it deeply wounded the soul. Shame, once sown into the public eye, was nearly impossible to remove. Number 16. The Pear of Anguish. This small but horrifying device resembled a delicate flower, at first glance. Crafted from metal and shaped like a bulb, the Pear of Anguish was inserted into a person's mouth, rectum, or, most often in the case of women accused of blasphemy or sexual crimes, the vagina. Once inside, a screw mechanism was turned, and turned, and turned. With each turn, 4 metal petals slowly expanded outward, tearing flesh and muscle from the inside. It caused unspeakable pain. Often, it left the victim unable to sit, stand, or speak properly for days, or forever. Infection, bleeding, and internal trauma were common, especially in an age with no antiseptics. There's debate among historians as to how frequently this device was used, or whether it was more of a threatening prop than a widespread tool. But its existence was real, and its presence alone could cause terror. The pear was often reserved for those who challenged religious authority or morality, midwives accused of abortion, heretics, sodomites, and those labeled witches. In this way, it wasn't just torture. It was a message about the body, about control, and about who held the right to punish and silence. Number 17. The breaking wheel. Perhaps no punishment was more infamous, more theatrical, or more agonizingly prolonged than the breaking wheel, sometimes called the Catherine wheel. This punishment wasn't just about execution, it was about display. A grim ballet of bones and iron. The condemned person was bound to a large wooden wheel, arms and legs spread wide. Then, using a heavy iron bar or hammer, the executioner would methodically break the limbs, starting at the feet, then the legs, then arms, avoiding major arteries so the victim remained alive as long as possible. Each blow was calculated. Crack, pause, crack, another breath. Once broken, the mangled body was woven through the spokes of the wheel and hoisted onto a tall post. There the victim might remain for hours or even days, bleeding, groaning, and finally succumbing to the elements, thirst, or birds of prey. The wheel was often reserved for murderers, highwaymen, or rebels. especially those whose crimes were considered particularly severe or symbolic. In some cases, townspeople were encouraged to watch, pray, or throw stones. In the end, it wasn't just a punishment. It was a warning nailed to the sky. Number 18. Crushing by weight, pressing. To force a confession, medieval courts sometimes turned to a slow, deliberate form of punishment called pressing, or peine forte dure. The condemned was laid flat on their back, usually on cold stone. A wooden board was placed atop their chest, and then weight was slowly added. At first, it might be a few stones or iron bars, then more, and more. The goal, a confession, a name, a plea for mercy. But in some cases, the victim refused to speak, and the weight kept increasing, until ribs snapped, the lungs collapsed, and blood ran from the nose and mouth. Death could take hours. Sometimes, it took days. One of the most famous cases of pressing was Giles Corey, accused during the Salem witch trials in 1692, well after the medieval period but rooted in the same cruel custom. Corey, refusing to enter a plea, was pressed to death. His final words were said to be, "More weight." The punishment was designed to compel compliance, but when met with silence, it turned into a terrifying show of what silence could cost. These punishments remind us, medieval justice wasn't always about law. It was about power, pain, and making sure everyone knew the cost of defiance. Number 19. Trial by ordeal. Before fingerprints, lawyers, or even formal courts, medieval justice often relied on divine intervention to determine guilt, and one of the most terrifying manifestations of this belief was the trial by ordeal. There were several types. All were based on the idea that God would protect the innocent and expose the guilty, by fire, by water, or by other means. In one version, known as the ordeal by hot iron, the accused would carry a red-hot piece of metal across a set distance, perhaps 3 paces. Their hand would then be bandaged for several days, and afterward, a priest would examine the wound. If it was healing cleanly, it was declared that God had intervened on their behalf. If it festered or showed signs of infection, it meant guilt, and punishment followed. Another variant was the ordeal by water. The accused was bound and lowered into a river or lake. If they sank, they were considered innocent, though they often drowned. If they floated, they were deemed guilty, as floating was thought to signal the rejection of holy water. There was even an ordeal by cold water for accused witches, where it was believed the pure element would reject evil. Women were often subjected to this ritual, bound, stripped, and tossed into water. Many died innocent. These rituals were not always meant to find the truth. They were meant to reinforce belief, to surrender judgment to the unseen hand of a divine power. And in doing so, the people felt justice had been served, even if it left a trail of bodies behind. Number 20. Oath-taking with torture, compurgation with stakes. In early medieval courts, truth was not always uncovered with facts. It was sworn into being. A system known as compurgation allowed an accused person to assemble a group of oath-helpers, usually 12, to swear on their behalf. If they all spoke sincerely, the person could walk free. But when compurgation was applied to serious crimes, or when a confession was demanded, it was sometimes paired with ritualized pain. In certain parts of Europe, the accused would be required to place their hand on a heated iron or into scalding water while swearing an oath, or they might stand barefoot on sharp stones, repeating a formal denial over and over, each time with more breathless urgency. This hybrid of oath and ordeal was psychological and physical warfare, a battle between one's resolve and one's flesh. To lie was to risk your soul. To tell the truth was to suffer anyway. Sometimes, a lie could be made truth by endurance alone. Number 21. Trial by fire, ordeal by hot iron. In some parts of medieval Europe, a common punishment, or rather, a method of determining guilt, was the ordeal by fire, often involving a red-hot iron. The accused would be made to carry a burning iron bar or walk across red-hot plowshares. Their wounds were then wrapped and re-examined a few days later. If the burns were healing cleanly, they were declared innocent, because, it was believed, God would not allow the innocent to suffer. If the burns festered, guilt was confirmed. This so-called divine judgment was not only excruciating but deeply arbitrary, relying more on superstition than fairness. Yet, for centuries, people placed their lives in the hands of this fiery trial. Number 22. The drunkard's cloak. In England and across parts of Europe, public drunkenness was a common offense, and one peculiar punishment aimed to humiliate offenders into sobriety. Enter the drunkard's cloak, a large barrel with holes cut for the arms and head. The offender would be forced to wear the barrel-like clothing and paraded through the streets as townspeople jeered. The punishment was less about pain and more about ridicule, designed to shame the drunkard into better behavior. Imagine staggering through a cobblestone market square in a heavy, awkward beer barrel, children pointing, women giggling behind their aprons, and men shaking their heads in disapproval. It was spectacle, theatre, and punishment all in one. Number 23. Iron chair torture. The iron chair, also known as the chair of torture, was one of the most terrifying devices used in medieval interrogations. This metal chair was covered with hundreds of sharp spikes across its seat, backrest, arms, and legs. Victims were stripped and strapped into the chair, and then slowly pressed down onto the spikes. Sometimes heat was applied underneath the chair to amplify the torment. It wasn't always used to kill, but it was a brutal method for extracting confessions. The psychological horror of just seeing the iron chair was sometimes enough to make a prisoner speak. Number 24. Scolds bridal, Brank's bridal. Women accused of gossiping, nagging, or speaking out of turn could be punished by wearing the scold's bridle, a metal cage that fit over the head, with a flat iron plate inserted into the mouth to depress the tongue. Some versions even had spikes. The goal was silence, humiliation, and control. The woman would be led through town, her head caged, unable to speak or defend herself, a bell often ringing above to draw attention. This was not simply about keeping peace. It was about suppressing women's voices and reinforcing authority. Today, it stands as a chilling reminder of how speech could be criminalized and punished with cold, clanging iron. Number 25. Tarring and feathering. This punishment is perhaps best remembered from later history, especially colonial America, but its roots stretch back into medieval Europe. Tarring and feathering was a brutal form of public shaming and pain. The victim's clothing would be stripped away, their bodies smeared with scalding hot tar, and then a sackful of feathers would be dumped over them, sticking grotesquely to their skin. The tar burned as it seeped into wounds and pores. The result was humiliating, painful, and hard to remove. The victim would often be paraded through the streets or tied to a cart for all to see. Though it rarely killed, the psychological damage was often lifelong, and the burns could become infected. This punishment was especially used on those accused of betrayal, theft, or disrespecting authority. Number 26. Pillory with rotten food throwing. The pillory was a wooden framework with holes for the head and hands, used to publicly punish offenders. But it wasn't just the confinement that made it humiliating. It was what happened next. Spectators would gather, jeering and throwing rotten vegetables, mud, eggs, or worse. Some threw sharp objects or stones, despite the laws forbidding it. The pillory could be used for thieves, blasphemers, or even petty merchants who used false weights. While the victim stood helpless in the wooden stocks, children laughed, dogs barked, and neighbors hurled every insult and piece of garbage they could find. Hours in the pillory meant sunburn, bruises, humiliation, and the memory of the town turning against you. Number 27. The Ducking Stool. Used primarily on women accused of gossiping, witchcraft, or moral misbehavior, the ducking stool was a punishment built for both pain and performance. A woman would be strapped to a wooden chair fastened to a long beam, then slowly dunked into a cold river or pond. The dunking could happen once, or repeatedly, until the victim was half drowned, freezing, and humiliated. In some cases, death occurred, especially in winter. Townsfolk gathered to watch, finding sport in the suffering. Ducking stools weren't hidden away in dungeons. They were public, theatrical punishments, meant to correct behavior by making an example. Number 28. Iron collar, neck violin. This device was a type of restraint used to punish quarrelsome individuals, especially women. Known as the neck violin or shame violin, it was a heavy iron collar with two large openings, one for each hand, and a neck hole in the center. The victim's arms were locked in the front, forcing them into a hunched and helpless posture. Sometimes two people who had argued, neighbors, spouses, or family members, would be locked into the same iron frame, forced to face each other until they made peace. It was both physically painful and deeply humiliating. In smaller villages, it served as a warning. Harmony was expected, and public disputes would not go unpunished. Number 29. The shame flute. Imagine, if you will, a man who has played the lute off-key in the town square, or perhaps someone who has told jokes deemed rude or performed music that offended the church or court. His crime may seem laughable now, but in medieval Europe, musicians, especially poor ones, could be publicly punished in humiliating ways. Enter the shame flute. The device looked like a long, clunky metal flute, but it was no instrument of melody. This contraption was made of iron and built to fit around the neck and fingers of the offender. The flute part had holes and keys like a real instrument, but instead of being played, it imprisoned the hands. The guilty man would be paraded through the market, the iron flute locked tightly to his neck and hands, forcing him to carry it like an eternal mockery. A sign might be tied to his chest reading, "Mocking musician," or "Discordant fiddler." Children laughed. Women whispered. Elders shook their heads in scorn. Wearing the shame flute wasn't painful in the way a whip might be, but it attacked something more delicate, a man's pride. The more he struggled, the more foolish he looked, attempting to play this mute, mocking instrument. The punishment often lasted for a full market day, enough time to ensure that the memory of the humiliation would last far longer than the bruises. It wasn't only musicians. Sometimes gossipers, slanderers, or anyone accused of verbal crimes were made to wear the shame flute, suggesting their words were as offensive as a broken tune. And when the metal was finally removed, rust-stained and still cold, the silence that followed was a reminder. The wrong melody in the wrong crowd could lead to disgrace. The shame flute was not violent, but it was haunting, a bitter little joke, played in reverse, with laughter aimed squarely at the punished. Number 30. The heretic's fork. Now, drift with me into a dim, incense-laced chamber, where a single candle glows before an altar. This is not a courtroom. This is a holy inquisition. The Church, in its mission to protect the soul, sometimes resorted to cruel tools of correction. One such device was small, but diabolically precise. This was the heretic's fork. It consisted of a short metal rod with two sharp prongs on each end. One end was pressed beneath the chin, the other against the sternum or the throat. It was strapped tight with leather belts, locking the victim's head in place. There was no movement, no nodding, no rest, no prayer. The slightest attempt to speak or lower the head would drive the sharp forks into flesh. But make no mistake, this device was not meant to kill. No, it was intended to keep the accused heretic perfectly still for hours, sometimes days, in a pose of enforced submission. Many victims were forced to wear the heretic's fork while standing in church, or while imprisoned before trial. It was a punishment of stillness, of silence, of total bodily control. Some were forbidden to sleep. If their chin dropped, pain would follow. Imagine the terror of not being able to rest your head, of holding your neck in stiff defiance, whispering silent prayers that the fork would not slip. For the church inquisitors, it was a way to force repentance, or at least the appearance of it. If the prisoner wept or collapsed, it was interpreted as a sign of guilt. If they endured in silence, perhaps their soul still clung to righteousness. The heretic's fork was symbolic in another way, a spiritual punishment rendered into cold metal. It said, in no uncertain terms, "Your thoughts have betrayed you, and now your body must obey." There were no scars, unless the prisoner moved, and so they stood, silent, sleepless, suffering, not from bleeding wounds, but from the cruelty of posture and the iron bite of faith. Let that image linger gently in your mind, if only to remind us how stillness can become its own kind of torment. Number 35. Torture by sound, bells of madness. In a world without modern amplification, the human body was still weaponized through the overwhelming force of noise. Among the more unsettling punishments was a lesser-known but terribly effective method: torture by relentless, inescapable sound. This punishment, rarely recorded but whispered of in monastic chronicles, involved shackling a prisoner in a confined stone chamber, sometimes beneath a church bell tower, or within a specially built sonic cell. Once inside, the individual was subjected to continuous loud noises, most often the repeated tolling of bells at close proximity. The acoustics of the stone walls magnified the vibrations until they seemed to shake the mind itself. Day after day, the bell would ring at random intervals. Just when the prisoner might start to drift into uneasy sleep, the clangor would strike again. Monks noted in old margins that within a few days, prisoners would weep, scream, beg, or simply fall into a trance-like stupor. The ears would ring even in silence. The soul would fragment slowly. There was no need for fire or iron, only sound. Some say this punishment was reserved for those accused of mocking the church or disrupting Mass, blasphemers, heretics, or madmen themselves. But others claim it was a secret tool of ecclesiastical courts, never officially sanctioned but whispered through the cloisters. It was not just physical pain that defined medieval cruelty, but the slow erosion of peace. Number 36. Ordeal by cheese, a monastic justice. If bells could shatter sanity, even cheese could serve justice. In some regions of medieval Europe, particularly in isolated religious communities, the ordeal by cheese was used as a test of divine judgment. It sounds comical now, cheese as a punishment, but it was taken in deadly earnest. The accused would be required to consume a chunk of hard, dry cheese paired with a slice of bread, usually sanctified by a priest or monk. The ritual was solemn. After invoking God's name, the person would begin chewing. If they choked or coughed, or if the food refused to go down, it was seen as divine confirmation of their guilt. A clean swallow, however, indicated innocence and the favor of heaven. Monks believed that the body, in its honesty, could not lie before God. Guilt would cause a seizing throat. Innocence would pass easily. But many accused, knowing what hung in the balance, were too frightened to swallow properly. The dry bread stuck to the roof of the mouth. The hard cheese crumbled in anxious hands. The punishment wasn't always fatal, but the consequences could be. Those who failed might be excommunicated, whipped, or imprisoned, and the emotional toll, fear, humiliation, and the cruel absurdity of fate decided by Derry, was its own kind of torment. These strange customs, preserved in monastery records and obscure legal codes, reveal just how surreal and imaginative justice could be in the Middle Ages. Even a meal, if twisted by superstition, could become a tool of torture. Number 37. The Dance of Madness. Forced dancing punishments. In the 13th and 14th centuries, across the Holy Roman Empire and parts of France, chroniclers recorded peculiar outbreaks of uncontrollable dancing. Though some believe these were mass psychogenic events, possibly brought on by ergot poisoning or mass hysteria, others whisper of a stranger, crueler custom tied to punishment, forced dancing as a public sentence. In certain towns, particularly during religious festivals, those accused of public disorder, heresy, or even adultery might be sentenced to dance, not once, but until they collapsed. Drums and fiddles would accompany the punishment, blaring out tunes as the accused were driven to exhaustion in front of jeering crowds. They danced barefoot on hot stones or uneven cobblestones. Sometimes their feet were greased to make them slip. In some records, it's written that nails or shards were scattered across the dancing square, though this was rare and largely symbolic. And the worst part? Laughter. The crowd was expected to cheer, jeer, and sing along, turning punishment into perverse performance. To fall was humiliation. To stop before commanded was disobedience. The public humiliation was paired with days of pain in legs and joints. One German poem described such dancers as leaving the square with their dignity limping behind them. Though not widespread, this punishment reveals how deeply medieval minds understood spectacle, how punishment could be theatrical, emotional, and long remembered. Number 38. The Flute of Shame, Musiker Schandfloat. While dancers were tormented with sound, musicians faced a punishment of their own. The Flute of Shame, also known as the Schandfloat. This punishment was most common in German-speaking lands from the 15th century onward, and was reserved for musicians who played poorly, fraudulently, or disrupted public peace. The device was a heavy iron flute-shaped collar. It had finger holes like a real instrument, but the flute was locked around the neck and chained to the fingers, freezing the hands in playing position. The offender was marched through the streets wearing this mock instrument, often while a real band played nearby to increase the ridicule. The iron bit into the skin. The fingers would swell. But worse than pain was the laughter of children and the scorn of peers. This punishment wasn't limited to musicians. Bakers who sold underweight loaves, or town criers who spread false news, might receive a similar fate with other custom-made shame masks. But the Flute of Shame is one of the most memorable, a haunting blend of irony, art, and cruelty. For all the violence of medieval justice, it is these quieter punishments, sound, dance, mockery, that most disturb the mind today. Not for their blood, but for how they twisted the soul. Number 39. The Transparent Cage. Glass prisons for the shamed. In late medieval Italian city-states, particularly in Florence and parts of the Papal States, there existed an unusual and psychologically tormenting form of punishment known as the glass prison. These were not prisons in the modern sense, but large, clear enclosures placed in public squares. The walls were made from transparent crystal-like material, or in some accounts, oiled parchment or horn to allow visibility from outside. Inside, the condemned, usually those guilty of moral or civic offenses such as adultery, embezzlement, or blasphemy, were confined for hours or days, left exposed to the gaze of passers-by. There were no blankets, no privacy. People came to watch. Some threw rotten food. Others mocked. Some sat quietly and simply stared. Women accused of seduction or gossip were more often placed in these cages of clarity, as some called them. The goal wasn't physical harm but social erasure, to isolate while being utterly seen. The body was untouched, but the soul, perhaps, was never the same. One 15th century diary in Venice mentions a merchant's daughter placed in such a prison after defying a priest's sermon. She was left there from dawn until dusk. She emerged physically intact, but refused to speak for weeks. Number 40. The Girdle of Thorns, a punishment of flesh and faith. Among certain penitent monastic orders, and occasionally among secular courts influenced by them, punishment took on a religiously symbolic but physically excruciating form. the girdle of thorns. This was a belt or sash fashioned from braided hawthorn, brambles, or in more extreme cases, barbed iron wire. It was tied tightly around the waist, chest, or even upper thighs of the condemned. Sometimes it was fixed so they couldn't remove it themselves. Meant as a form of prolonged penance, the girdle would dig into the skin as the person moved, walked, sat, or lay. The punishment was used for perceived sins of the body, especially lust, adultery, or vanity. Women who adorned themselves too finely could be sentenced to wear one under their garments. Men caught in brothels or clergy found guilty of carnal acts were sometimes forced to wear it beneath their robes during sermons. Though it echoed Christ's own crown of thorns, this punishment had nothing sacred about it. In heat, the wounds festered. In winter, they bled. And the condemned, forced to carry on with normal tasks, were left in constant pain. The most extreme sentences lasted for weeks. Records suggest that some who wore the girdle later chose to keep it voluntarily, believing the pain brought them closer to God. But for most, it was simply quiet torture wrapped in the language of redemption. These punishments remind us that pain, in the Middle Ages, wasn't always about swords or chains. Sometimes it was light, attention, or silence. Sometimes it was simply being made to feel seen, or being made to feel less than human. Number 41. The Hunger Hole. Starvation as Sentence. Beneath the stone floors of some medieval castles and abbeys, especially in parts of Germany, Poland, and rural France, lay small, airless chambers known colloquially as hunger holes or oxenlock. These were cells with no doors, only a narrow shaft through which a prisoner was lowered, and sometimes a few scraps of food were passed. Those placed inside had committed crimes considered both grave and irredeemable, often heresy, repeated theft, or treason. No windows, no bedding, no heat, no trial in many cases. Monks who broke vows too often might be confined here by their superiors. Nobles accused of plotting against lords could be vanished this way. Sometimes a person was simply dropped in and forgotten. The name Hunger Hole was no exaggeration. Starvation wasn't an unfortunate byproduct. It was the punishment itself. The goal wasn't just death, but slow death, a moral cleansing through gradual erasure. Occasionally, the prisoner would be retrieved after a set period if they repented or confessed. But often, the silence that followed meant the pit had claimed them completely. Centuries later, when certain castles were excavated, bones were found curled against stone, silent witnesses to a justice system that believed hunger purified the soul. Number 42. The Feathering Pole. Humiliation in the marketplace. Before tar and feathering became known in early modern England and colonial America, a quieter, almost comical form of humiliation was practiced in medieval village squares, feathering without tar. This punishment was most commonly used against men accused of beating their wives, unfaithful lovers, or those who scammed their neighbors. The village women often carried it out themselves, especially during public festivals when mock trials were staged. Here's how it went. The man was seized, sometimes by the Women's Council or by outraged villagers. He would be stripped to his breeches or under tunic, paraded through the market square, and doused in egg yolks, lard, and honey. Then, villagers would toss handfuls of chicken or goose feathers at him, which stuck to the sticky mixture on his skin and clothing. Laughter followed. Cheers. Sometimes songs were sung about his sins. He'd be tied to a pole, or even ridden backward on a donkey. It may sound humorous now, but for a man whose status relied on dignity and power, it was utterly destroying. He couldn't retaliate. If he did, harsher punishments awaited. He could only walk, feathered like a plucked goose, through the laughter of people who once respected him. Some men fled towns rather than endure this again. It was social punishment, swift, humiliating and difficult to forget. Where the hunger hole made one disappear, the feathering pole made one visible in the worst possible way. Number 43. The bite of the beetles. Insects as instruments of pain. Deep in rural Europe, especially in parts of the Germanic and Baltic regions, a gruesome little punishment was sometimes used in medieval villages, particularly for petty thieves, adulterers, or disobedient farmhands: the beetle box. The accused would have their hands or bare feet placed inside a small wooden crate or basket filled with biting insects, usually blister beetles, ants, or even carpet beetles collected from grain stores. Once sealed inside, the creatures, sensing no escape, would panic and begin to bite or burrow into flesh. The pain wasn't just sharp, it was slow and maddening. Blister beetles release a chemical called cantharidin, which causes intense burning, swelling, and oozing blisters. The victim could scream, but the punishment wasn't technically violent. No blood was spilled by human hands. These beetle punishments weren't always state-sanctioned. They were community responses, often applied on the spot by landowners, innkeepers, or even neighbors. The message was clear: if you steal from our storehouse, lie to your master, or touch what isn't yours, you'll feel the bite. The injuries weren't usually permanent, but they left marks that stung for days, if not weeks. And perhaps more damaging than the skin wounds was the knowledge that it was not the king's men or the priest who punished you, but your own village. Number 44. The beheading block. When mercy looked like death. In a time when punishments were often prolonged, stretching over hours or days, the beheading block was sometimes considered a mercy. Execution by sword or axe was usually reserved for nobility, knights, or high-ranking officials. It was seen as a death befitting someone with honor, even if their crime was treason. The condemned would be led to a wooden block, polished by the necks of those who came before, and either kneel or lie down. A sharp blade, wielded by a practiced hand, could end it in a single clean blow. But it didn't always go so smoothly. A poorly trained executioner might miss his mark. There are records, painful to read, of 3, 4, even 5 blows before a head finally separated. The crowd would watch in growing horror. To prevent this, some nobles paid the executioner in advance, often with extra coin, to ensure a swift cut. And Bullen, for example, was granted a French swordsman rather than an English axe for this very reason. His sword was faster and cleaner. Yet even this merciful death was a spectacle. The beheaded body often fell twitching to the ground. The head, sometimes still blinking, was lifted and shown to the crowd. Nobles were not spared the public theatre of justice. They were merely granted a more dignified curtain call. Some medieval thinkers believed that beheading released the soul faster. Others argued that the head lingered in awareness for a few seconds longer. Regardless, it remained a favored punishment for those too powerful, or too beloved, for the rack or fire. Number 45. The drunkard's cloak. As the sun rose over another sodden, grey morning in the villages of northern England, the townspeople gathered at the square. Their feet crunched across frost-tipped cobbles, and breath steamed like smoke in the chill air. Today, someone would wear the drunkard's cloak. This peculiar punishment was both absurd and humiliating. A large wooden barrel, hollowed, dried, and roughly cut, had holes sliced in its sides, 1 for the head, 2 for the arms. When a man was found guilty of drunken behavior, disturbing the peace with loud brawling or belligerence, he would be placed inside the barrel, which hung around his torso like a shameful tunic. He looked ridiculous, like a child playing knight in a wine cask. The villagers would laugh, point, and sometimes throw things. He was paraded through the streets in this absurd costume, the barrel weighing heavily on his shoulders as it scraped along with every step. The intention was clear. This was not a punishment of pain, but of public ridicule, a reminder to all that intoxication would not be tolerated in the Queen's towns. And still, the message lingered longer than bruises might. The memory of shame, of laughter, of pointing fingers, was sometimes enough to stop the next tavern-goer from reaching for that extra mug of ale. Number 46. Crushed under stones. Some punishments were slow and heavy, not just metaphorically, but literally. One such sentence was pressing to death, or peine fortitudo in medieval legal terms. This grisly method was used primarily on those who refused to enter a plea in court. If a suspect remained silent, refused to admit guilt or innocence, the Crown could not proceed with trial. The solution? Force an answer through agony. The accused would be stripped and laid flat on their back. A board was placed atop them, and then slowly, stone by stone, weight was added. The first stone might press the ribs like a warning. The second squeezed the lungs tight. The third might crack bone. Some pleaded quickly to escape it. Others, out of desperation or stubbornness, endured the weight in silence, choosing death over what they believed was an unjust system. Those who survived longer could linger for hours, or even days, until breath was finally crushed from them. It was a terrible, intimate death. Not loud, not sudden, just the slow creeping of pressure until the will to resist was broken. Number 47. The slipper of shame. In parts of medieval Germany, small humiliations served as civic reminders to behave. One such object was the iron slipper, a boot-shaped metal device, often heated and forced upon those who gossiped, lied, or slandered their neighbors. Sometimes called the slipper of shame, it was part punishment, part public display. A liar or a false witness might be dragged to the town center, stripped of shoes, and made to stand as the red-hot slipper was brought out. They were made to insert a foot, hesitant, trembling, into the metal casing. Even if it wasn't heated, the slipper was designed to pinch, press, or even cut the foot. The pain was intense and left scars not easily forgotten. Meanwhile, a wooden sign might be hung about the person's neck. "I spoke what was false." Once released, they limped away, foot blistered, shame sealed to their memory. And those watching took note. In places where people's words could undo lives or spark chaos, the slipper made them pause. Number 48. Excommunication and exile. Not all medieval punishments were physical. Some struck the soul. When a person committed grave moral or political errors, blasphemy, heresy, or betrayal, they could be excommunicated by the church or banished by the crown. To be excommunicated was to be spiritually cut off. You could not receive sacraments. You could not marry within the church. You could not be buried in sacred ground. In the eyes of the faithful, you were condemned. Some villagers would refuse to speak to you. Others would avoid your home, fearing that even contact could bring spiritual danger. To be banished was equally cruel in another way. You were no longer permitted to remain within the city or region. In some cases, a person was told to walk away from everything they had, home, farm, family, and never return. It was punishment by loneliness, a cold kind of justice. The community you once lived among would forget you by necessity. Number 49. The oubliette. In the dark heart of certain castles lay a cruel form of punishment. The oubliette, a tiny dungeon whose very name comes from the French oublier, to forget. It was a cell meant not just to hold someone, but to erase them. The oubliette was a vertical pit, often only accessible from a trapdoor above. The prisoner would be lowered, or dropped, into the space, barely large enough to stand. No windows, no light, often no bedding or food. Some were left for days, others years. Some were never removed at all. Their bones were found centuries later, curled against cold stone walls. It wasn't a punishment of immediate violence, but one of isolation, deprivation, and time. Few who spent more than a few weeks in an oubliette came out unchanged. And in some castles, it was not spoken of at all. The doors simply closed, and life continued above, as though the forgotten prisoner had never existed. Number 50. Boiling to death. The final punishment in our list is perhaps the most gruesome. In the 13th and 14th centuries, during a wave of intense legal reforms, the act of boiling alive was introduced as a penalty for specific crimes, primarily for those who poisoned others. It was a terrifying, fiery spectacle. A large cauldron was filled with water or oil and heated over a roaring fire. The condemned would be tied and slowly lowered in. Not all at once. Limbs went first. Feet, then legs, then torso. The heat scorched flesh, the skin blistering and sloughing off before death took them. Crowds often watched. There was no subtlety in this punishment. It was dramatic, symbolic, and designed to horrify. The logic was that poisoners killed in secret, silently. Their punishment should be loud and unforgettable it was. The image of a man screaming as he boiled became etched into the minds of those who dared consider the crime. Eventually, even kings deemed it too barbaric, and the practice faded. But for a time, it was all too real. And now, our list is complete. 50 real medieval punishments, each one more curious, terrible, or fascinating than the last. As the final page turns and the echoes of the past drift quietly into sleep, we find ourselves reflecting not only on pain, but on how far justice has come. Thank you for joining this long and haunting journey. If this video helped you learn, wonder, or simply fall asleep, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. We'll see you again soon, with another journey into the strange and silent corners of forgotten history. Good night.